Search of Black Power. I'm your host, Lawrence Grand Prix. As many of you know, the organization that supports this podcast, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we work with a variety of organizations that do different types of work in Baltimore, and part of the way we support the organization is by doing different trainings, talks, providing logistical information to help these organizations do their work better. So the podcast for this month is somewhat of a look behind the curtain into some of the work we do with some of our partner organizations. It's a talk that we actually gave to a partner organization that's tasked with taking some money and basically redistributing it in a way that helps the Black community. And when you're in nonprofit spaces, you're in spaces with foundations, you hear a lot of ideas about abstract concepts like economic redistribution, like universal basic income. And these ideas are gaining more purchase in the political sphere, the leftist space, the progressive space. But our understanding is that there isn't an in-depth understanding of what these concepts are. And there isn't an analysis of the limitations of these concepts in producing the goal that we set out as the foundation of our organization, which is the self-determination of Black people or people of African descent here in America. So this talk is designed to frame concepts around economic redistribution, so-called baby bonds, universal basic income, and job guarantees from this perspective of looking at the gaps in the discourse, what they leave out, looking at places where, while these ideas produce a lot of happiness and hope within people, there's a gap potentially between the reality and the theory. And basically starting a conversation that we hope will lead to conversations about solutions that build institutional power, as opposed to solely focusing on redistribution to individuals, but redistributing money and power to institutions that are accountable to community. So community has the political and institutional engines of advocacy and power needed to secure our livelihoods politically as a community beyond an individual bank account, an individual job. Who is deciding what gets built with a job guarantee? Is that something that could hurt the Black community or help the Black community? If we're talking about breaking people out of poverty, what is the poverty line? Is it a good place to have a poverty line? Is it an accurate assessment of are we improving people's lives? Or is it a political tool used to reframe what is largely an example of survival economics, which may help people get needed services in the short term, is an attempt to frame that as a revolutionary political intervention? And are we confusing individual survival with political power? If so, why? Why do we get psychologically attached to these ideas? What are the political conditions that brought them into our political discourse? What were people responding to? What were the historical political conditions of the 90s that made these interventions appear so revolutionary, but also limited the scope of what we could actually imagine revolution being? So this is a talk designed to take all those concepts and frame it through the lens of Black community self-determination, pan-africanism, and beginning a conversation that we look forward to having in the future with this organization, and we look forward to having in the future with you all. So potentially having future conversations or talks and trainings we give to this organization could be turned into podcasts. But whether that happens or not, this space is a space where we begin to interrogate and, like I said, go deeper and have space for intellectual idea reframing and questioning some of the dominant discourse. So with that, thank you, and we look forward to presenting this talk about economic redistribution and how to understand these concepts, prioritizing Black community self-determination. Even though there is a policy perspective that animates the push towards things like universal basic income and baby bonds, and that will be the focus of this talk, there's an interconnection between the nonprofit space and the policy space. And this talk is to use the policy as a space to theorize how collectively can engage these theories and to see how policy conversations are impacting conversations foundations and nonprofits are having about how to redistribute economic resources. So The only way out is through. It's a general concept. There's a lot of what I perceive as progressive approaches to economic redistribution, seeking to find ways around this history of anti-Blackness that has stopped economic redistribution. And though they claim to be race conscious, I would argue they largely avoid some fundamental questions of community sovereignty and anti-Blackness that are essential to actually get the redistribution we're all looking for, so to go through that. So I put this picture on there. This is probably, I believe, one of the 10 most important days for Black people in America in the past 50 years. But very few people know what this is. This is New York. This is 1975. This is the so-called New York bankruptcy crisis. And this is a very particular moment where, as you know, cities don't take money in and pay it out. They run on bonds. So they run on banks giving them money. And because of white flight, because of, the Bronx is burning, perceived crime, there was a feeling that New York could no longer cover the bonds of like the pensions for the union workers, for the welfare benefits it was kicking out, for paying college tuition for people to go to city university cheap. So this is literally the day when New York goes to the bond markets and none of the bankers showed up. So if you look at the other side, there's no bankers responding to their bids for bonds. And this is the moment where cities are basically terrified. No city wants this moment to happen. One thing they say in Baltimore is every decision in Baltimore is made with the bond rating in mind. So this puts a huge chill on locally based policy around economic redistribution, union pensions, local contracting, and pushes the conversation to be federal. So this video is a supercut of a larger documentary called The Century of Self. It's by a guy named Adam Curtis, who's British. But this is about Clinton's policies and the politics around Clinton's approaches to economic redistribution. So this is going to be about 6 minutes, and then we'll just pick it up from there.
Was that Bill Clinton had decided to tailor his policies to fit with these voters' desires. Above all, with their ferocious belief that they should only pay tax for things that benefited them, not for the welfare of others.
I have no idea what percentage of my tax dollars go to welfare, but even if it's a minuscule percentage, even if it's a quarter of a percent, it's still too much for the people that are receiving these benefits that are basically non-productive.
The Clinton team decided that to win, they had to promise tax cuts for these suburban voters. Optimism was to be short-lived. In November 1992, Clinton was triumphantly elected president. But within weeks, his administration discovered that the budget deficit was far greater than they had anticipated. At a meeting in the White House in January 1993, the head of the Federal Reserve told them that the deficit was nearly $300 billion. There was no way they could borrow any more without panicking the markets and causing a crisis. The only way to pay for the proposed tax cuts would be to cut government spending, not just on defence, but on welfare. Clinton was faced with a choice between the old politics and the new, and he chose the old. The tax cuts were dropped, and he tried to inspire the country with the old democratic ideal of government spending to help the poor and disadvantaged.
Tonight I want to talk with you about what government can do, because I believe government must do more.
At the start of the Clinton administration, many of us, including, I believe, President Clinton himself, reverted back to an older tradition, tried to lift the public, to talk about genuine ideals beyond the individual. And that reform agenda being not only universal health care and child care and dealing with the widening inequalities in our society and homelessness, many things that many citizens, just particularly middle-income citizens, didn't want to deal with.
But the suburban voters who had been promised tax cuts were not inspired by Bill Clinton's vision. They felt betrayed and wanted revenge. Their opportunity came in 1994 with the congressional elections. The Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich, promised huge tax cuts and to dismantle the welfare system. The voters who had defected to Clinton switched sides yet again, and the Republicans won both houses of Congress in a landslide.
Well, I think it's a tremendous vote in favor of smaller government, lower taxes, and in a sense, a renewal of the Thatcher-Reagan tradition. And I think in that sense, it's pretty decisive.
It means that the welfare state is going to be less hospitable for people who are not willing to take responsibility for their own situation. No question about it.
I think today is the beginning of the end of the welfare state.
The neuropersonality poll allowed the Clinton team to segment swing voters into different lifestyle types. They were given names like pools and patios, or caps and gowns, who were urban intellectuals living in university towns. From this, the team could identify ways in which they could make individuals feel more secure in their chosen lifestyles, just as business had learned to do with products. Dick Morris called it small bore politics, tiny details of people's lives and personal anxieties which politics had never even thought about or noticed before, but which now had become the key to winning power.
So we got into people's heads, understood their psychology, about lifestyle, about values, what they thought was important, what issues they wanted politicians, and particularly the president, to address. And these issues proved to be very, very different from what the conventional wisdom had suggested.
As the election campaign began, Clinton revealed Morris's new approach to a shocked White House. All traditional policies were to be dropped. Instead, he would concentrate exclusively on policies that targeted the worries of the swing voters. V-chips would be fitted into televisions to prevent children from watching pornography. And mobile phones would be fitted into school buses to make parents feel more secure. Dick Morris also persuaded the president to spend his leisure time in the same way as particular groups of swing voters. He sent Clinton on a hunting holiday, dressed in exactly the Gore-Tex outfits a group called Big Sky Families liked. The aim was to reflect swing voters' lifestyles back to them. But Morris's new politics were an extraordinary success. Clinton's ratings among the swing voters began to soar. And Dick Morris, along with the marketeer Mark Penn, took effective charge of making White House policy. Mark Penn set up a huge call centre in an office block in Denver. And every night, hundreds of telephone operators called swing voters in suburbs across the country to check with them every detail of policies that Clinton was proposing. Morris also insisted that Clinton make a symbolic sacrifice of the old politics to convince the swing voters to trust him. In August 1996, Clinton signed a bill which ended the system of guaranteed help for the poor and unemployed. Welfare would be cut back after 2 years in order to force people into work. The new system was called welfare to work and would, he said, be a hand up, not a handout. It was the effective end of the guaranteed welfare system created by President Roosevelt 60 years before. For many in Clinton's cabinet, it was also the end of the progressive political ideal that Roosevelt had represented. The belief that one used a position of leadership to persuade the voters to think and behave as social beings, not as self-interested individuals.
Dick Morris and the pollsters had won.
This is setting the context for the present moment. So with the Great Recession, so this is just how great the Great Recession was, you begin to see political backlash. So this looks like Occupy Wall Street, but this is before Occupy Wall Street. This is 07, 08, during the Great Recession. So there is this great moment of possibility, but Obama comes in. And with that, the progressives feel the racialization of resistance to government. So the fact that there's a blackface in front of the federal government, progressives that otherwise don't think about race were forced to think about the backlash to government spending as racialized. So this is the Republican governors rejecting free federal money. So this is, again, the progressives, everything they're doing now was a response to this. So this is, maybe you remember 10 years ago, they wanted to do a high-speed rail in Florida, but the Republican governor got more political juice, putting a middle finger to Obama, rejecting the money, even though that would have created jobs in his district. Right, so these are the conditions that contemporary progressives are responding to, saying we need to have very specific strategies to deal with this backlash. Similarly, Obamacare, Medicaid expansion, free money, but it was rejected by Republican governors, and why is that? So I don't know if you remember this ad, but this was an anti-Obamacare advertisement in like 2011. And in it, save time, didn't want to show the video, a white woman comes into the doctor's office, says, "Doctor, will see you," and this person pops up. So the idea is not just the government is creepy. It's hard to view this in the age of Obama without the racialization of the state, the racialization of white bodies, and the racialization of healthcare. So this is a quote I like to use. Even though I don't love this guy, David Field Goldberg, we can talk about that offline. Racial meanings have animated neoliberal attacks on the welfare state. Attacks on affirmative action reveal a deep critical concern for neoliberals' trouble over race. In the US, neoconservative critics of the state implicitly identify as representing Blackness and the interests that most directly advance Black life. As a result, both of serious application of anti-discrimination legislation and affirmative action policies, the state became the single largest employer of African Americans. Perception among critics of these programs, accordingly, devolved into the view that Black people were either employed as beneficiaries of affirmative action or they supported by welfare. In short, from the 1970s on, the state increasingly came to be conceived as a set of institutions supporting the undeserved. Neoliberalism, therefore, can be read as a response to this concern about the impending impotence of whiteness. So I like that term impotence within the context of creepy Uncle Sam, and I don't know if you all even see responses to the bridge collapse. Apparently some people are saying it's because they gone woke and hiring Black people to do the ports now, and that's why the bridge got hit. So these notions of the state being tied to Black people are very deep. And again, this is something every progressive policy to redistribute revenue is dealing with. So what was Obama's response? So not great. Obama actually struck a deal. He saw he was being a political genius. To either the Republicans would agree to increase spending overall, or there was this time period called the sequestration where automatic cuts to all federal spending would kick in. Republicans called his bluff, and government spending actually decreased under Obama, because even with Republicans getting like military contracts in their districts, white people use a lot of welfare, use a lot of food stamps. Even with that, they were willing to allow sequestration to go into effect because they thought they got political juice from shrinking the government and screwing over Obama. So what is Obama's response? And I think it's partially the progressive response, is to turn closer to technology, to technocracy, to the tech sector, to tech money, to smart people with smart solutions based upon the market. So this is him with Zuckerberg. And this would have been early in his campaign. He was seen as the Silicon Valley president. And I want to say this not only should be seen as part of his economic policy or social circle, it's part of the way he thinks about the world, and it impacts how we think about progressive redistribution policies today. Because what is Obamacare? Obamacare is largely a handout to insurance companies to allow them to insure previously uninsurable people with pre-existing conditions and expand coverage. So these are highly complex, highly technocratic, market-based mechanisms that many progressives claim to be resisting. So many of we'll see next to Bernie Sanders progressives are going to be like, we hate that. But the mindset of technocracy, the mindset of intelligent elite policymaking, I think implicates even the progressives who would claim, we want Medicare for all, we don't want Obamacare. So there's some shared intellectual DNA between the progressive world and the Obama world that, though they claim to be very distinct and at odds, I think it's important to understand, and we'll try to get to a little bit. All right, so this is important because in this moment, post-Obama, we begin to see a political realignment. So for the first time, you see college-educated whites support Democrats more in 2016 with the backlash to Trump, right? So going forward from 2016 to 2020, COVID obviously changed things in terms of government spending. So you can see as a percent of GDP, non-defense spending has substantially increased since COVID, and leading some to even say, well, did we do it? Did we destroy the neoliberal era, this notion that everything must be based upon the market, everything must be highly tailored to people's concerns, and the cultural politics of Clinton. But then you see things like them not doing student debt relief, the massive generational divide over student debt relief, and to say we haven't gotten rid of neoliberalism, but clearly something has shifted, right? So in this moment, in a response to Clinton, a response to the racism of Newt Gingrich, the Contract to America, And what they see as a response to the limitations of Obamaism, there is a new, like, progressive mainstream, policy that's kind of being produced. And I say this is race-conscious progressive economic redistribution. So this is kind of like part of the mainstream theory of how to do policy, what is good politics, how to make meaningful change that implicates the push towards baby bonds, the push towards universal basic income, and some basic tenets of that. I wrote too much. Please don't think you have to write all this down. We can get you these slides if we need to. But I just wanted to put on paper my thoughts and some of our thoughts about what's happening now. So concerns over economic redistribution may be caused by anti-Blackness, but the best strategy to get folks to support it is to point out how it hurts white people and get them on side with universal class-based distribution policy. Thus, we should focus on universal redistribution policy that will disproportionately benefit Black folks. And this is race-conscious progressive economic redistribution, right? So oppositional policies trigger resistance, focus on, this is a term that people use a lot, positive sum, win-win policies that show how economic redistribution benefits everyone. So the argument is that in the past, talking about 99% versus 1%, Black versus white, you're claiming that someone has to lose. So if we focus on how investing in Black people boosts economic growth or decreases welfare spending, everyone, quote unquote, benefits from that. And that shifts it from zero sum, a trade-off, to a positive sum. Focus on best practice in technology to alleviate concerns about corruption. We can talk more about that later. Show programs save money long-term to address fiscal concerns. Split policy into tax code to avoid budget fights. So we don't have to get into all the nuances here, but this is an important part of baby bonds especially, because the idea is that we do a lot of redistribution in this country, but to the wealthy via the tax code. And our people don't benefit from that. So if we strategically use the tax code, then we can get benefits to our people that don't have to go through these big federal budget fights. So again, this isn't trying to present the best version of the argument, even though we have some criticisms of it. It has its own logic to it, right? Class-based economic investment in the most needy and sympathetic victims creates political, that should be wins, and durable policy. So we'll get to this in more of the explanation of how universal basic income has been rolled out, baby bonds focused on children, and some of our criticisms of that, but the theory is that, well, these people are innocent, babies are innocent, so it's harder politically to say, you know, we don't like them, we don't think they deserve anything. Last thing, most money is good money. Since people of color are disproportionately poor, trade-offs using class-based criteria are worth it because the need is so great. We call this the people are dying every day argument. So this is something that is constantly sown at our people, constantly used to push back against demands for more substantive political infrastructure. It's like, well, we gotta get the short-term victory because the needs are so great. So I think these 7, and we can copy and paste these if you want them, but I think these sum up the impulse, the political theory behind how people are thinking about some of these progressive redistribution policies. But before I introduce you to those policies, I want to introduce you to some of the theoretical foundation for how we understand the limitations of those policies, which is interest convergence. So you all probably may know who this guy is. This, of course, is Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory. His theory of interest convergence stems from his work with Brown v. Board as a lawyer, and sort of viewing that the progress made, quote unquote progress made by Black folks, seems to happen when it's in the interest of powerful people for that progress to happen, and determines the nature of the progress. And I think this may be something people have heard before or vaguely heard before, but even me, it took me deeper to think about it to understand that this isn't just something that's like a piece of the puzzle. Like this is interest convergence when it comes to Black people is very, very serious and big business, right? So one of his strongest arguments, I think, is when does Brown happen? It doesn't happen during the tumult of race riots per se. It happens in a particular moment. Does anyone know the year? Yes, that's what a lot of people think. People think it's the 60s because, you know, the tumult and all that, but Brown happens in 1954. So what's happening in 1954? You have the first time you have integrated platoons of soldiers fighting together in Korea. And that's actually the moment when we signed the ceasefire, not the peace, but the ceasefire in Korea after the Chinese sent all those soldiers over the Korean border. So this is the moment when it's clear we're not going to defeat communism on the battlefield. And you have a bunch of armed black men coming home to America used to working with white folks and used to being somewhat equal to them and maybe won't accept being subordinate to them. And they have guns. Right, so this idea of interest convergence, again, it's not just a random thing. It's like it was really in people's interest to show some progress, because what happened in the Red Summer, those World War I veterans came home in 1919. We had massive race riots. So there needs to be some progress given the realities changing. And again, in the moment when you could not beat communism on the battlefield, you had to beat communism in the world of public relations. So this is actually Ruth Bader Ginsburg talking about the PR value of the Brown decision. The U.S. Information Agency promptly placed articles on Brown in most every African journal. Time magazine commented, in many countries where U.S. prestige and leadership have been damaged by the face of segregation, it will come as a timely reassertion of the basic American principle that all men are created equal. Newsweek magazine observed segregation in public schools has become a symbol of inequity. Now that symbol is shattered in Africa. Coverage was extensive. The weekly African Nouvelle reported on Brown under this headline, "At last, whites and blacks in the U.S. on the same school benches." So when you talk about sending a public relations symbol to Africa, this is not theoretical. This is like the stuff coming from the Congo, the cobalt, the uranium. You know, you can do a coup. Coups are messy. We know they did a coup in DRC, right? But it's really messy. You'd rather have them choose to trade with you, choose to give that billions of dollars in raw material to the Western world. Because otherwise, look, Ethiopia, Angola, they're part of the Soviet bloc. So all of the resources from Ethiopia, Angola, they're going to the Soviet world. America's losing out on billions of dollars because of, in part, bad PR. Because think about all the underlying countries. You got Egypt, you have Ghana, then you have South Africa, which is in the Western sphere of influence because of apartheid. But they're fighting a revolution. Is it going to be a socialist communist revolution? Or is it going to be a pro-Western capitalist revolution when they kick out apartheid? So the point is, interest convergence when it comes to doing stuff for black people in the context of the Cold War was a billion-dollar industry and a real thing. And my hypothesis is that when it comes to progressive redistribution for black folks in our current moment, this is a billion-dollar industry and a real thing we have to take seriously. Because look at the demographics of, in quote, Black Lives Matter. So this is a Black Lives Matter protest in 2020. You can see the diversity in the crowd, but when you do the actual analysis, it was mostly white. 2020, most of the people protesting in protests in 2020 were white folks. Now, that's not to say that that's inherently problematic, but then you have to understand the larger political dynamics at play, right? So I really like this. And maybe you all know this, but I think it's important to understand just how big of an industry nonprofits are. So according to the 2019 report, the Center for Civil Society Studies at Johns Hopkins University, nonprofits account for roughly 1 in 10 jobs in the United States, private workforce. Total employees numbering 1.2 million in 2016. Over the decade since 2007, the Great Recession, nonprofit jobs grew almost 4 times faster than for-profit jobs. For the first time, nonprofit employment now equals manufacturing. Retail, trade, and accommodations and food service are the only U.S. industries that employ more people than nonprofits. So when we talk about the sorts of services, the human social service sector, the beneficiaries of progressive redistribution, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. You know, the nonprofit sector, including churches, is, I believe, around a $2 trillion industry in the United States of America. And who is benefiting from that massive expansion in nonprofit jobs? So this is the workforce. So like of all jobs, this is like of all people employed in the sector. So you have disproportionately female, you have disproportionately advanced degrees. And with that, you have particularly women in swing states making up the margin for Biden in his victory over Trump in 2020. So you put all that together, you have what I think is a way to understand interest convergence in relation to progressive economic redistribution. And this is the theory that I use when I think about baby bonds, universal basic income, and job guarantees, which are going to be our three examples of progressive, class-conscious economic redistribution, right? And again, don't feel the need to copy it. Just think about it. I got about 15 more minutes, hopefully, and then we can get to Q&A. Race-conscious progressive redistribution rebrands interest convergence as positive sum, which ultimately obscures the reality that Black people have to build power to force policy to invest in our community. Most investments in the new post-COVID-19 world have benefited the professional managerial class and should be seen as Biden and Democrats funding their new electoral base while selling Black and brown voters that these policies are their salvation. The cost of increased public flows of money have been forfeiting demands for Black community sovereignty, and positive sum should be read as trying to sell Black people that white people benefiting from policy claiming to benefit them is actually a good thing. And I think that last point is, I think, especially salient and something we have to grapple with, because again, the political theory is that makes the policy economically durable. If white people are benefiting from redistribution, then they're less likely to backlash against it like they did in the 90s with Clinton. So it's the trauma of the 90s, the trauma of Reagan, the trauma of Obama that folks are responding to with this new race-conscious progressive redistribution. But just like how there was a sacrifice of the old politics and welfare reform in that clip I showed you, I believe that there's a sacrifice moment, which is Black self-determination, right? So now, with all that, we can get to some of the examples. So we'll start with, and I will say real quick, these examples all kind of bleed into each other and bleed into some other things that people talk about as redistribution. So UBI and child tax, and baby bonds, there isn't a clean division between them. So it's going to bleed together a little bit. I apologize for that. But what we call UBI, these are typically pilot programs set up with a mixture of, in our current moment, ARPA money and foundation support. One of the most prominent ones before the pandemic was Stockton, California, and they were very adamant to reject the notion of the welfare queen. These policies are often targeted at poor people, oftentimes single parents, oftentimes single mothers, and the idea is that, well, they're just going to spend it on destructive things. So they're very adamant to point out that if you look at the pie chart of what they actually spend stuff on, most of it's food and retail, so transportation, housing. So this was really trotted out as like a gotcha or a rejection of the pathology projected onto Black mothers especially. I think that that's important, and I think that it's true, but also think of it as interest convergence. All these people are benefiting from all this spending, and that tends not to be a focus on any of this money going to people in the community to, focus on building community institutions that can build power off of this investment, right? So similarly, I think that one thing that I want to stress is this is the total data collected of individuals in all the pilots. So only 8,000 people have gotten data collected from these pilot programs. So we have not gotten to the point where UBI is actually broad-based economic distribution. It's a collection of pilots. And it's a collection of pilots really just sort of scattered around the country in these 100 cities. So similarly, and this is too small to read, but this is some of the justification of UBI. So it's an automatic stabilizer. So that means that in the midst of an economic decline, this cash always going out will help buffer the impact of economic decline. So cash is care. So that's talking about Black and brown women benefiting disproportionately from this. And cash is worker power. So cash serves as like a universal basic income could serve as like a de facto strike fund to help workers. And I think all this stuff is true, but it is also interest convergence. So you have organized labor benefiting from UBI. You have this being a universal program, but being targeted as care of Black women. Look how happy she is, right? There's something emotional happening in how this policy is being sold. An automatic stabilizer, that's stabilizing the economy for everybody. So that's really like, it'll help us prevent a recession, which will hurt everybody. So still, focusing on Black power, focus on community institutions are not there. It's focused on how it stabilizes the economy for everybody. So this is a long quote, but I'll just read it because I do think it's important. UBI's daunting financial challenges raises fundamental questions about its political feasibility. Both now and in the coming decades, proponents often speak of an emerging left-right coalition to support it, UBI. But consider what UBI's support on the right advocate. They generally propose UBI as a replacement for the current welfare state. That is, they would finance UBI by eliminating all or most programs for people with low or moderate incomes. Consider what that would mean. If you take the dollars targeted on people in the bottom fifth or two-fifths of the population and convert them to universal payments to people all the way up the income scales, you're redistributing income upward. That would increase poverty, inequality, rather than reduce them. Yet, that's the platform on which limited support for UBI on the right largely rests. And it entails abolishing programs from SNAP, which largely eliminates the severe malnutrition found in the Southern Black Belt, Earned Income Tax Credit, Section 8 vouchers, Medicaid, Head Start, Child Assistance, and many others. These programs lift tens of million people, including millions of children, out of poverty each year and make tens of millions more or less poor. So this is, I think, an example of the limitation of interest convergence as a policy methodology. Because in order to make UBI more mainstream, many of you might remember Andrew Yang, the Yang Gang 2020, he has like a more right-wing version of UBI that some people say, yeah, let's just get rid of all food stamps, all SNAP, let's make that UBI. So you get your one cash payment, but then you don't have Medicaid, you don't have the other stuff, and then people on the left are like, wait, those programs are political infrastructure. Those programs are part of people's lives and part of a way in which that infrastructure is important. You can't just cut it. So they understand the importance of infrastructure when it comes to the poverty programs we currently have. But I think there's a similar critique of progressive versions of UBI, where they aren't thinking about investing in Black political infrastructure. They aren't thinking of the sort of systemic, institutions that benefit from Medicaid and Medicare. There's no focus on building infrastructure for anything that UBI would actually go towards. It's just recognizing the importance of the existing policy infrastructure that already exists. So they get it when the right wing is attacking them. They don't get it when the Black community or Black self-determination advocates are attacking them. And the whole point of this is this deep emotional concern. And this will be talked about in the child tax credit conversation, which is very different but similar. Is that, but look at the poverty rate reductions. We just have to get poverty rates down. And it's like this emotional cudgel they used to beat people who ask these questions of them with. Let's actually look at the poverty rate. And so this is important. So when you talk about the poverty rate, what is the poverty rate? The federal poverty rate was set in '63. And it is 3 times the cost of a minimum food diet in 1963 adjusted for inflation. So that's how we set the federal poverty rate. It is a random assortment of things people ate in the 60s, times 3. And that federal poverty rate is, for a family of 4, is $25,000. So if you actually do a more comprehensive analysis of the poverty rate to include contemporary clothing, shelter, utilities costs, for a family of 4 in most places, it's closer to $45,000. So when you talk about decreasing poverty, it's literally getting people from below 25,926 to above 25,926. So 26,000, 26,100, 26,200. All that counts in the way they tell the story as dropping the poverty rate. You're not changing anybody's life inherently. You're not fundamentally changing the conditions they suffer from. You're just shifting people from below an arbitrary line to above an arbitrary line. So the reason I showed that clip at the beginning, because I think this is lifestyle politics. I think this is a certain type of person, a cap and gown, in the language of the video, who desperately wants to feel like they're doing something good for oppressed people. And something like UBI or child tax credit fills a psychological need they have to feel like they're advocating for policy that's genuinely transformative. But they don't want to think about the games people play with, like the poverty rate number, because that would ruin the fantasy. That would mean they would actually have to think deeply about political economy and the complexity of how it's nowhere near the 45,000. That's the actual poverty rate. So that's why I like that video, because I do think that it's no longer swing voters. It's now the Democratic base. But Biden is feeding policies like UBI to the Democratic base to give them a sense of psychological satisfaction that's very similar to what Clinton did in the 90s. And I think this is a good example of that. So again, I can send you this later, but most UBI policies are paid for with ARPA money or philanthropy. and are targeted at young mothers or the poor because they cost the state more. So that's like, we'll save money on food stamps, we'll save money, yada, yada. And as we saw, that argument can be reversed against them. This recapitulates the very logic of austerity the organizers claim to fight and cannot be scaled up to broad-based redistribution. So right now we have a bunch of pilots. We don't have a broad-based federal redistribution policy. The child tax credit was quickly repealed. We don't have that, and I think partially because the logic they're using, they don't need that. What they need is to feel like they're doing something and feel good. And what they're doing allows them to do that without fundamentally challenging power or redistributing power in ways that would benefit Black folks. UBI approach fails to build economic and political infrastructure, and thus puts money into the economy but not into the Black community, or power into the Black community. And desire not to pathologize poor and Black communities leads to a focus on constructive spending while ignoring the social impacts of destructive survival spending. And this is something I was going to talk more about, but for the sake of time, like talking to people in the Black community, I mean, you'll hear people say things like, yeah, I took my stimulus check. I know people who took their stimulus checks, went to California, bought pounds of weed, and were selling pounds of weed from the stimulus check. And that's not to pathologize that behavior, but progressives oftentimes can't talk about that because they're afraid of feeding right-wing talking points. But we in our community, if we perceive this sort of influx of money creating a sort of scam culture, a sort of culture of, more people selling drugs, more people using drugs, we don't have a space to talk about it because they're going to say, shut up, you're going to feed the welfare queen ideology, and you're going to mess up the policy for everybody. So we have real psychological needs and trauma in our communities that can be exacerbated by just putting cash on the ground. And some people say we saw that during the pandemic. This isn't an easy conversation to have, but there's no real space to talk about it within the political theory being used because that's too dangerous to the mythology that this is a great policy, there are no backlashes to it, it helps everybody. Let's just keep quiet and not talk about that. All right, so baby bonds. This will overlap a little bit with the previous conversation. This is Sandy Doherty. He teaches at University of North Carolina. That's Derek Hamilton. So he's associated with reparations and baby bonds. Derek Hamilton, I believe, is at Ohio State. So I had a conversation with Derek Hamilton, and he basically said, like, look, I did baby bonds in part because Black people were saying, y'all keep talking about reparations, they're never going to do reparations. So you got to do something that'll actually pass, or something that we can kind of get behind. So his theory is that, well, people love children, so what we do is we have a small amount of money in the pot as soon as a child is born, and the state can add to that pot per child depending on the conditions, but basically the pot of money grows because of interest and investments in the market. So if we're going to have this focus on white money in the markets and tax policy, we need to do something to allow Black people to benefit from that, right? So the idea is that in most versions of the policy, a small amount of money, or a substantial amount of money even, is put into a pot when the child is born. It then matures by investments in the market or bonds, and then when they become 18, it can be invested in productive investments. So starting a business, buying a home, education, right? And again, there are multiple versions of it. We can talk more about it in Q&A. But of course, our governor is a supporter of the policy. And there is a local ballot initiative that's trying to be put on the ballot for a Baltimore baby bonus investment. I don't think it's likely to get put on the ballot, but this will be a $1,000 one-time payment for every child born in the city of Baltimore. So this isn't the typical, like, put it into a government pot and it gets matured over time. It's a $1,000 payout for every kid. So again, this is a universal policy. So same amount of money from Roland Park as it would be for Cherry Hill. So again, like, who benefits more from that, right? And I thought it was interesting because, again, the charter amendment language they're using is, they said it right here, it's equal to the language they put in for the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. And I thought that was a good juxtaposition, because for all the limitations of the Youth Fund, that's a political institution that we can put demands on, that we can demand to be accountable to us, that we can demand changes, we can demand changes in leadership. And this is not that. This is a $1,000 payment, and once it's gone, it's gone. So I do think that them using the language of the Youth Fund to structure their language for their amendment is interesting, because I think it presents a possibility that these sorts of visions of economic redistribution are trading off with these sorts of visions of economic redistribution. Or at least they're not thinking about political infrastructure in that way. All this is done in the name of building a nest egg, so you build an investment, the nest egg, it goes from a small egg to a large egg, right? So you start off with like a tiny little chicken egg. Over 15, 20 years, it grows into an ostrich egg. And I don't want to focus too much on this, but I do think that if white people are already starting off with the ostrich egg, all of the investments they already make all the time set the market. So they're already going to go from an ostrich egg to an elephant bird egg. So going from a chicken egg to an ostrich egg is good, but them going from the ostrich egg to an elephant bird egg means they still winning. So the idea that it can fundamentally close the racial wealth gap, I think is challenged by the fact that they're marking our advancements to the market. White people set the market, they got more money than us. So doesn't that mean inherently they stand to benefit more in this political arrangement? And our desire not to challenge them in their accumulation of wealth, do we continually set ourselves behind in this manner? But this is not the most important thing. This to me is the most important thing. Of all the people being audited, people who claim the earned income tax credit, which is disproportionately black and brown people, are up to, you see it here, 5 times more likely to be audited by the government. So that was Derek Hamilton's big challenge. When I challenged him, it's like, won't white people just benefit from this? And he's like, no, we're gonna make it tied to wealth. And we know black people don't got no wealth, so that means that black people are gonna benefit because the fact that we're gonna tell the government we have no wealth means we're gonna get more baby bonds. But it's like, if we do that, and black people are already audited up to 5 times more than non-black taxpayers, if you make a baby bond that's worth any real amount of money, I think this is just gonna increase. I can't imagine it not increasing. And dealing with the reality of the policing in the system, there's no conversation about that. There's no conversation about these fundamentally anti-black mechanisms that are gonna prevent these sorts of policies from actually manifesting themselves. Because we know black folks have money off the books. We know they engage in survival economics. Making a baby bond worth tens of thousands of dollars would really make the stakes of policing that so much more lucrative and so much more dangerous for black people. And the fact that these sorts of economic redistribution policies don't take on notions of state violence means that they're susceptible to this limitation. So I know I'm running out of time, but I'm gonna try to get through this quickly. So baby bonds affirms the logic of market capitalism and financialization. That affirms the capitalist system causing much of our community's oppression. Baby bonds adopts the logic that reparations for slavery are politically impossible, pushing against broad race-based fiduciary policy in favor of promoting use as innocent victims, which not only violates African-centered notions of intergenerational connection, but can be weaponized against other forms of redistribution to quote-unquote guilty people, like reparations to war on drugs. So this to me is, I think, one of my anxieties I have around baby bonds, is that it does have a focus on innocence of use that challenges notions of valuing elders and just challenges notions of adults who need help. So it's almost like they did their time, they gotta suffer, we gotta focus on the children. And it almost cuts off the focus on the political capital to the children. So I'm just gonna try to skip ahead to job guarantees, because I think this will hopefully put a bow on the video and allow us to grow into Q&A. So job guarantees, it really stems from the mythology of the 30s, the Work Progress Administration, Roosevelt, from the video. And this is like the vibe of the work job guarantees movement is like this photo, like a romanticization of the 30s when we got to do murals and they paid us to build dams and they paid us to do all this stuff. So you see conversations of like a Green New Deal. I know it's slightly different, but it's a similar vibe. It's that there is just this emotional connection to connecting to particularly bucolic America, but a glorious American tradition of the 30s when Roosevelt was making jobs for people that could maintain a family. So there's a real nostalgia to this, and there's a real cultural theory to it. I'm gonna have to skip some stuff, I'm sorry. But yeah, so a good example of this is high-speed rail. So high-speed rail, like this is a meme that's like, wouldn't it just be great if we could just hop on the high-speed rail and travel America? And it's 15,000 likes, right? So that's like a deep I think, resonance of what a jobs guarantee could do. They almost always use build railways when they talk about jobs guarantees, even though they also use that for Green New Deal. But what do we know about the maglev train that they're talking about building into Baltimore? They have two proposed stops, Cherry Hill, Camden Yards. So either you're gentrifying Cherry Hill or you're further reconsolidating resources in Camden Yards that Orioles just got bought by a billionaire, right? So the actual reality of this jobs guarantee, people would get jobs building the highway, but the actual result would be a massive gentrification of Baltimore for Black Baltimoreans. And there's no systemic focus on Black people getting durable jobs that last beyond when the train is built. But there is a reality of massively increasing the housing costs of bringing those people from DC to Baltimore. But there's no conversation about that with these 15,000 people who talked about how much they would love to travel the rails in America, right? Last example, because I do think it is really important, is another example they often give for jobs guarantee is we have to fix the pipes. The pipes are filled with lead, the racial impact of the water crisis. And one thing that I realized a few years ago, and I know you can't read this per se, is that water is not the most common source of lead poisoning. So water qualities in Flint have nationwide concerns about child exposure to lead. Experts say drinking water is not a common source of lead poisoning. So for all the concern about children and the horror of Flint, the actual World Health Organization points out a number of causes, but the main one's actually paint and paint chips. Like the massive paint settlement, lead settlement we have here in Baltimore is from paint chips in like public housing and whatnot. But yet all of these different World Health Organization sources, they don't really talk about pipes, water pipes. But, so why do we keep talking about water pipes? Besides Flint, it is the ability for unions and union jobs. They've been actually the #1 pushers of making pipes the center of the lead conversation. And that's not to say that fixing lead pipes is bad, it's to say that it's interest convergence. When you have unions that have seniority and you have white political leadership in unions, there isn't a similar political push to have a cadre of people strip the paint out of our homes and save our children. What the science will actually lead us to is to hire thousands of Black folks to go through these homes to actually deal with the lead paint crisis, but there's no union that would benefit from that. There are construction unions that would benefit very, very much from fixing out all these lead pipes, even though that's not the main source of lead contamination in our community. So I think that that's just where I want to kind of get to the conclusions. None of this is really going to be anything that's too surprising, that we should reject interest convergence for forced fortuity. That's Derek Bell's term, where you force people to recognize the interests of your community. You just don't passively wait for their interest to benefit you. You force their interest to engage your community. Organize Black folks to demand race-conscious redistribution, focus on sovereignty, adopt a both-and approach. This isn't to say that any of the things I talked about are inherently wrong, because you may be at a conference and someone will come to you and say, you know, baby bonds is where it's at. Collectively, I should really do that. These are just questions that you can ask them to think about why that's happening, to think about the politics and emotion behind it, and sort of say, well, if it's going to happen, who's going to manage the UBI pilot? Who are the consultants? Who's it going to go towards? Like, what are the other things in the community we can build to actually make that benefit our community more? And that's what I mean. Focus on implementing any of these measures of flowing through Black organizations, reflecting Black or African culture, and be sure to reflect a path to universality within the Black community and reflect African concept of Ubuntu. So I think that's especially that concern about baby bonds that I see happen a lot, which is, well, the children are politically the most sympathetic. So that's where the winner is. And I think that's almost like a fetishization of youth that's often very common in Eurocentric cultures, while African cultures that have a more veneration of elders have to say, we can't just have one generation get benefits and let the other people not get anything. So I think there is a sort of deeper conversation of African-centered conceptions of justice that we don't have the time to get into today, but I wanted to introduce it as a foundation for future conversations. All right, so I appreciate you all working with us with the tech. I appreciate you all working with me with the time, but I do think we have like 30 minutes-ish for Q&A, and hopefully the food will be here soon. Well, that pilot, no.
Not the
What I showed you, that's universal. Every kid in Baltimore would get it.
What about like what Wes is sort of co-signing on?
I haven't researched if he has an actual proposal. I don't think he has anything in the legislature. I think that comes from his time with Robin Hood.
Okay.
So typically with baby bonds, they do have, like I said, a wealth screen where whatever you would submit, where you would have to vouch and what your assets are. And the idea, again, is that since black folks don't have a lot of stocks, a lot of real estate, that white people who have wealth would therefore get a smaller baby bond than black folks. And again, my concern is that, well, white folks will still be getting baby bonds, but all the money white folks have in the actual market, for real, all the houses they own appreciating in value, all the stocks they own, like they would just naturally get all the benefits of a baby bond without a baby bond. And you raise the possibility of, if I declare that I have $30,000 in income, but I got a $15,000 side hustle, that $30,000 is going to get declared, and are they going to take the baby bond away or audit me if I show more than $50,000 in like the house I buy or something like that? So there's just a reality of, state violence being not talked about with baby bonds, where it's like we may have, white folks and black folks may have the same level of no wealth, but if one family is dealing with the intergenerational impacts of incarceration, if they're dealing with all these other factors of state violence, then none of that's accounted for. It's just an abstract financial calculation that all proposes that the market goes up. And therefore, we as black people then start rooting for the market to go up, as opposed to challenging capitalism or challenging financialization. So there's just all of these components of baby bonds that I think, to use Davon's language, it almost feels like suing for peace. Like in the midst of the comprehensive attack on black people, the way Derek Hamilton told me, it was a response to people. He said reparations, but I think you can also read that as any race-based redistribution policy. People don't have any hope that it's going to pass. So now we have to adopt these universalist policies that, doing some jujitsu, are going to disproportionately benefit black folks. And I think that there's a huge cost of sacrificing race-based redistribution policy or race-based redistribution theory for the universalist policy.
Well, I was looking at some of the baby bonds that look income-based, but I thought too was you're not necessarily taking into consideration, let's say black folk who may have larger income, but have an enormous amount of debt. So
Exactly.
Like I got $20,000 in college loan.
Exactly.
But my income might take me out of a certain bracket. So
Yeah, and again, white folks are going to be in the same situation, but they could also get that same amount of money, but they structurally may be set up better to get benefits in the future. So then it's like, one of them has it so they redo it every year. So they have one version of baby bonds where it's like every year you do a tax return, and based upon how good or bad you're doing, we're going to either add money to your baby bond or not. So I know people are trying to think about this, but it does just become like, if that is the case, then if you lose the election, all of that's wiped out. So you're assuming a durable political system, and if Trump gets in or if a Republican governor gets in, your future baby bond is gone. We hope you enjoyed that sample from the talk we gave about economic redistribution and how to prioritize black community self-determination as a lens to evaluate what are currently dominant perceptions of economic redistribution in the American progressive space. So in future episodes, we're going to try to do something we hope will become a staple of this channel, this podcast, what's evolved into. Deep dives into concepts, pieces of literature, books, ideas that have become central to people's political perceptions, theories about what works and what doesn't work for black people in politics, and provide what we think is a much needed space to evaluate and oftentimes criticize what we see as dominant texts, dominant figures within that space. So don't want to commit to anything quite yet or reveal the secret, but we're working on a review of a very, very popular text that has become very, very prominent in terms of how people evaluate political effectiveness, political strategy, political coalitions, and bringing our unique take to these ideas, these texts that have become so central to the discourse. So we look forward to bringing that to you. We look forward to deepening the conversation, and we look forward to continue to go in search of Black Power. I'm your host, Lawrence Grand Prix. See you soon.